politically incorrect for it to be a Yeti. Well, good early evening, late afternoon to everybody. It's good to see you all here, and I'm really glad that everybody is here, and I'm excited to talk to you all. Particularly, I'm going to talk to you about guns and how to fight this in your state. How to fight very specific pieces of legislation and policy that is now creeping in state by state by state by state. And I've written 2 books so far on it, and, well, one was basically on explaining why Trump won. And then the first book that I came out with, a lot of things have changed with regard to not just federal law, well, things have been proposed federally, but a lot of things have changed state by state as well. But anyway, just finished radio, came over here, well, finished all my production with radio, came over here, and I'm glad that you guys are, I'm just getting all set up. I'm glad that you guys are here to do all of this. So before I get started, because my goal here in talking with y'all is to essentially figure out what gaps I can fill in so that when you go back to your states and you're talking to your constituents and you're being attacked in the press and by the opposite party and by gun control groups that are increasing their spending in so many different state elections. I mean, we saw what happened in Virginia just this week, and that was with the additional help of, I think it ended up being just a little bit over $3 million, almost $3 million that Bloomberg spent in that state to help flip that state legislature. And now, of course, we hear that Northam is going to be calling for universal background checks, red flag laws. They're going to limit purchases. They want to limit purchases to 1 gun a month. That's just some of the stuff that they're talking about proposing, and they'll probably get it done, which is what's terrifying. So I want to make sure that I equip you with ways to defeat this in your state and ways to win any debate that you're going to get into on this issue. That is my whole goal. And if there's something that I don't answer, I want you to ask me. We'll do a Q&A afterwards, but I'm going to go over just some of the big stuff with all of this. Because how many of you, by the way, how many of you are dealing with this fight pretty heavily in your state? Good, that's a pretty good. How many of you have lost this fight in your state? Ooh, I love you. It's going to be happening to, I hate saying this, it's going to be happening to pretty much, well, everybody's going to be dealing with it. All right, so I have all my stuff here. So first off, what I wanted to get into is essentially, pull this up. Oh, I'm not going to be able to open this up. I don't have any internet. Oh, here, let me grab my phone. Give me 1 second. It's the voice of God now. All right, now we're good. So, red flag laws and universal background checks. These are going to be the 2 big things that are y'all are going to be fighting. And this is something that we're dealing with at the state level, obviously. Texas, we're dealing with it federally. There's a couple of pieces of legislation in the House. There's also something in the Senate as well. That is getting into all of this. I know I've already had Dan Patrick on my show here in Texas to talk about why he supports universal background checks, which is insane, because it creates a registry. I want to point out this tweet from Dianne Feinstein. I wanted to make sure I had it verbatim. She tweeted this just a few days ago because it marked on November 5th was the I don't like to say anniversary, but it was 2 years since Sutherland Springs took place. And 26 people lost their lives because an individual who was a prohibited possessor was allowed to legally purchase a firearm because his record wasn't submitted to NCIC, which is the National Crime Information Center, and that's what everything, when you go and buy a gun, your 4473 that you fill out, it checks that center, and it's supposed to stop bad guys at point of sale only if those records are actually being submitted. So she tweets this. And this was on November 5th, and I thought this was ghastly. She wrote, 2 years ago, a shooter took 26 lives in Sutherland Springs. The shooter was able to buy guns despite a domestic violence conviction. We need to pass universal background checks and other common sense bills to prevent such tragedies from happening again. Now, there's so many things that are wrong with this. And I noted to her that it was actually stopped by a hero with an AR-15, my friend Stephen Williford, and I asked her, and she's never answered. We reached out to her, we tried to get her on air, I've reached out to her staff, I've tried to get a statement, I've done this 6 ways to Sunday, and I've asked her, I said, well, please explain this to me, Senator, since the Air Force was the entity that had failed to submit this individual's record. He was court-martialed, he received his due process, his rights were revoked because of his willful violent actions. He had beaten up his wife. And why was it that the Air Force, how do you plan to check his record when the Air Force didn't submit his record into the database that is supposed to be checked? How do universal background checks solve that?
That's a good one.
She never answered that. I mean, I'm not surprised, but she never answered it. How is that solved with a universal background check? And I told her, I'm like, I await your answer. The thing about universal background checks is, number one, the only way they're gonna work is with a registry. Universal background checks, that's a fancy phrase for criminalizing private transfers.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Private transfers are not the things that are driving up the crime rate. In fact, there have been a number of studies on this, and there was a government report out that came out a couple of years ago where they verbatim said, yeah, in order to make universal background checks work, we're gonna have to have a registry to do it. There's no way to not. And there was also, 1 year ago, there was another report that came out, and they surveyed felons. They surveyed incarcerated prisoners, and they asked them, they said, oh, where did you get your gun? And the overwhelming majority, it was over 80% of them, said that they got their firearm from the black market. So it's not, my father-in-law giving my son a hunting rifle that is contributing to the crime rate. It is not you acting in accordance of your rights and acting lawfully and engaging in a lawful private sale with someone that you know. That's not what's driving the crime. That's not what's driving up the crime rate. It's the black market that is providing these firearms to these individuals. And I also think language is important when we're talking about this. I hate the phrase illegal gun. I hate the phrase illegal inanimate object. There is an action that determines whether or not an individual is behaving in a legal fashion. In my opinion, all guns are legal, or should be. But whenever someone is prohibited through their own willful action from owning one, they are an illegal possessor. They are a prohibited possessor. The guns itself is not illegal. It's little bitty changes to language to condition people into believing that these inanimate objects, and by way of this, our rights, that we should be prohibited from accessing this. So 2 things that I want you to realize. Number 1, never in a million years apologize for our rights when defending them.
Absolutely.
Never. Never, never, never. The second thing is, and I have been asked this by a number of lawmakers, since before the stuff with Ukraine and everything else. I've had a number of senators and from members of Congress that have reached out and asked me about a number of different proposals that were either in committee or that Democrats were getting ready to bring out of committee in the House or that were being discussed in the Senate. And they were all terrified to talk about these with their constituents and in their states because they were afraid of gotcha moments and things like that. And I told them, I said, there is a way, and this is the second thing, there is a winning way to talk about this without compromising a single thing. Absolutely. And that's what I want to help you with. So the first thing that we were discussing, red flag laws and universal background checks. Well, first, and here's the big problem with this, you have to define red flags, you have to define what this is. And at the bare minimum, red flags are a complete usurpation of due process.
Right.
And this is what I was actually talking to a congressman about this just a couple of weeks ago. And I said, so the big thing when you're messaging this and you're talking about this with your constituents, or you're in front of maybe an audience that might be kind of hostile to your message and your rights, think about it like this. Forget the gun aspect of it. Completely eliminate that variable. What red flag laws are doing is they are setting up any variable, not just firearms. It is a revocation of due process in a ton of different instances. I have asked progressive friends, what is your issue? Is your issue, the war on drugs? Is your issue criminal justice? Is your issue, illegal immigration and you want amnesty, et cetera, et cetera? Imagine this applied to every single one of your issues. If you're concerned about the corruption in our justice system and you're concerned about this now, how do you think that this is going to work when we suspend due process? Because it completely flips it. 17 states so far individually have passed red flag laws, and I've read every single one of these laws. I don't have a researcher and I don't have a staff. That's one thing. So I make sure that I read all of this so that when I'm on television, I don't ever get caught off. And my husband can attest. I maybe sometimes get 4 or 5 hours of sleep at night. I'm constantly reading everything. And I've read every single one of these laws. And I've seen some that are being proposed but yet haven't yet made it all the way through that process. Every single one of these laws, there's no exception. Due process is completely just a second thought. It is not considered a priority in this, which is terrifying to me. And in most of these, I think Vermont may be the exception, if memory serves, but they require the lowest standard of evidence to obtain, which is scary because you're talking about having your rights suspended just on the lowest standard of evidence. That's really frightening. So it doesn't even really have to do with firearms. I mean, what it does is it establishes a precedent that can be used against an individual to essentially declare them guilty before they've had their day in court. And all of these individuals that are against guns, how many rights do they want to suspend just to go after one? Is it worth it to them to do that? That's the argument that needs to be made first and foremost about red flags. Is it worth it to you to forfeit your right to be considered innocent until you are proven guilty in a court of law? Because that is what you are sacrificing in order to try to chip away at the Second Amendment.
That's right.
And it doesn't repeal the Second Amendment. It doesn't eliminate it. It just eliminates due process. Right. That is terrifying. And we will never, ever get that back. Ever. That's the scary thing. Once a right is lost, it is lost.
Yep.
We've seen this. So that is to me, and I was telling this member of Congress, that's the first and foremost thing you need to be discussing. Everyone wants to focus on guns, and the winning messaging for this debate is to actually remind people this is more than just about guns. We're gonna make it not about guns, because this is about rights. These are about rights, first and foremost. So, red flag laws, a total abrogation of due process. It inverts the order of innocent until proven guilty to somewhat guilty until proven innocent. I was reading a case of a man in Florida. I talked about this on air. This is unbelievable. So in Florida, they have red flag laws. And there was this gentleman who ended up getting in trouble. He had police come to his house. They served him. He had been red flagged. They wanted to take his firearms because his name was very similar to that of, actually it was exactly the same as this other guy who had committed a bunch of crimes, engaged in a lot of felonious activity while illegally possessing a gun and all of this other stuff. And so they wanted to go and they were trying to serve this red flag on the guy that they thought was correct, a very young man in his early 30s who had all of his hair, unlike this guy who was like in his 50s and he was bald. He's like, clearly I am not this man. Didn't matter. He still has to go to court. Last I checked, he was still going through the process, fighting to free his name. He has to pay in order to get his property back and to defend his rights. And then a lot of these red flag laws that have been passed in these states, you're not granted counsel, you have to pay to fight. There also isn't any recourse for you to engage in civil litigation to sue the person who falsely accused you. There's no provisions for that either. And also, Marco Rubio's bill, as it relates to red flags, that's also not, that's also, his is just as bad. His is pretty much similar to the 17 others, what the 17 other states have, what they've passed as it relates to red flag laws. Also, red flag laws, here's the other thing, why do we need them? If we just followed the law. Everyone always, for instance, they always say Parkland. Well, Parkland, they didn't need red flag laws. They had an individual there who, as it came out later, this murderer was so violent and so dangerous, he had to be frisked and have his bag checked every single day before he entered school. Nobody in the media really talked about that, did they?
Nope.
He brought knives, he brought bullets, he held a gun to a kid's head previously. He beat his mother so badly he knocked teeth out of her head. He threatened to kill numerous of his fellow students. And if anyone is from Florida here, do we have Florida? Anyone from Florida here? Okay, well you understand with your state law, if you are and it really doesn't even need to be state law. This is actually, there's federal protections for this too. It's not protected speech to, if I text you and say I'm going to kill you, that's actionable. That's not protected speech. And he had so many of those where he had messaged through social media and through other different platforms and just text message. He messaged so many different death threats to people. He could have actually been, if they would have followed the law, if former Sheriff Scott Israel would have followed the law, they could have arrested this murderer before he was able to legally purchase a firearm. You did not even need a red flag in this situation. He was breaking the law. He was violating the law, which goes to my point about language again. Everyone always acts like loopholes. We have loopholes. I want to be really clear. There's no such thing as a loophole. You have a criminal act and a not criminal act. If someone has their license suspended, if they get a DWI and they're out still driving, that's not a loophole. That is a criminal act. And we need to accurately refer to it as such. We have to fight for the language just as much as we fight to protect our rights, because that's all part of it. So there wasn't a loophole here. This murderer was engaging in criminal felonious activity because what he was doing by Florida statute was considered a felony. And so that was never exercised because of what former Sheriff Israel was doing with the school board there and with Robert Runcie. The idea of reducing the crime rate was to literally stop reporting it. And they considered that a reduction of criminal activity. It's pretty unbelievable. For instance, in Charleston, everyone keeps saying the phrase Charleston loophole. How many of you have heard this phrase? Everybody says Charleston loophole. This one is even more, this is as infuriating. They're all sickening. So Charleston, the bowl-cutted racist murderer who ended up shooting a bunch of people as they sat with him and even prayed with him, this individual was a prohibited possessor. In that particular state, if you are charged with a felony, not convicted, you're considered a temporary prohibited possessor, as I understand the law. And the problem was, and former FBI Director James Comey issued a statement about this, which is still available at FBI.gov. What happened is the woman that was actually filing the paperwork and was doing, the back end of things, didn't know the geography well enough, and made literally a paperwork error, which allowed his sale to go through. A waiting period would not have stopped this because it wasn't discovered until after he had murdered innocent people, and then through the investigation, it was discovered that he was actually a prohibited possessor. And that's when Comey had to release this big statement, and then it was just sort of not really covered by media, and everyone kept saying Charleston loophole, Charleston loophole. It would have never been discovered had he not done what he did. The system is as good as the people that are running it. I mean, I could go on and on. In Orlando, that individual was known to law enforcement. It was being watched in Dayton, the murderer in Dayton, Ohio. This individual, it was almost step by step the same as Parkland, which some of those families at Parkland have become very good friends of mine, and it infuriated them that they saw this happen again with an individual who wrote, published, and spread around school. He wrote it on the bathroom wall, a rape list of girls at the school and a kill list of boys at the school. This is not protected speech, this is considered actionable, and because he had a violent history. But he was able to go and purchase a firearm because nothing was ever acted on. So you have innocent people who are being told that they have to pay the penalty of the system that's supposed to protect them from not following the law and actually protecting them. This is what is incredibly upsetting. Borderline, the same thing, the Borderline massacre in California. This individual was called, they had law enforcement called to this individual's house in which he lived with his mother because he was shooting up her house.
Come on.
And when they arrived, they determined that he wasn't a threat to anybody. They're just gonna let him go. What does a universal background check have to do with that? You don't even need a red flag law. You follow the law. There's the law. Red flag law is an attempt to create an entirely different law, a set of laws, while suspending due process. So private sales, universal background checks, can't work without a registry. One of the questions that I always had is, how do you propose to expand a system and create more work for a government that can't handle what we have now?
Thank you. Exactly.
Because that's it.
Thank you.
Private sales are not the problem. There is no data whatsoever that supports the argument that private sales contribute to homicide committed with illegally possessed firearms. None. I have looked for it. I always try to be able to argue both sides of an issue, and I have sought this out. I have called every friend that I could call to determine if I've missed something, and there is nothing out there that supports this. Nothing. But what we do know is that prohibited possessors and sentencing reform and all of this, that actually is what is contributing to this, which is what we're going to talk about. So when you're talking to people really on either side of the aisle about this, there's several things that you can incorporate in order to help persuade, because ultimately isn't that what we're trying to do? We're trying to persuade people to see the actual reality and common sense of this debate. And tone and response and policy comes into this a lot. Another friend of mine who is in the Senate, a lawmaker who's in the Senate, was saying, I can't just tell them that this isn't going to work and then walk away and leave it at that. And I understand what they were saying, because you feel in a way that you have to offer something. Okay, if we're not going to do this, let me offer this as a consideration. And you can absolutely do that. I mean, there are things that can be done. So what I tell people, there are things that we can do immediately, tomorrow, and they would have been done if Democrats actually wanted to do it. So, and here's something else, by the way, too, when you're talking, especially to people who disagree with you, where it concerns the red flag stuff. The people who report your Twitter account and your Facebook pages and everything else because they dislike your opinion, they want you to trust a government-run system where people can, without serious penalty of law, report you and have your property confiscated before you're allowed to defend yourself in court weeks, even months later. Politicians refer to law-abiding, gun-owning Americans as domestic security threats, yet want you to trust them in the implementation of such a system. So, that's true.
Yep.
They're undermining their own argument here, which is very fascinating to me. So when we're talking to people about this, first off, we have to explain the reality to them, and they need to be able to see themselves in this position of losing a right. And so to me, that's one of the first things I say. I spoke recently in Boulder, Colorado, where they passed it's an ineffective ordinance that they've banned pretty much all semi-automatic firearms. And I walked in because Antifa was sitting there and they were getting ready to raise some cane. And I said, how many of you think that this administration, they're a bunch of horrible bigoted Nazis and they're just going to run roughshod over you and all of your rights? And of course the whole section of Antifa raised their hand. And I said, okay, how many of you only want those people to have guns? Because that's what you're arguing when you're pushing these policies. So we have to expose the reality of all of this to these individuals, and that's one of the ways to do it. We also, and for whatever reason, mental health is never a huge discussion in this. Mental health, sentencing reform, and looking at criminal justice are the things that are going to solve this problem, not any other policy that government is going to create. We have a society that champions a disrespect for life, abandons responsibility for one's actions, and a society that redefines criminal activity by calling it a loophole instead of a criminal act, and a culture that accepts violence as a legitimate form of disagreement. And we have also a society where good male role models are hard to find, and thus it's creating a crisis among young men that is not attributable to video games. So, when we are looking at showing the realities of these proposals to people, they need to imagine what these laws would look like if someone like me took office, because I am not meant for office. I am not meant for elected office because I have a temper and I'm sassy, and you people are way better equipped to that than I am. You know, and that right there, that should be a wake-up call to these people, but it's not. So this, pull this up. I have a lot of data here. And I'm going to have you all ask questions too to determine how deep you want to go into some of this stuff. So with policy, and policy proposals. Like I said, that friend of mine in the Senate was asking, well, what can I offer? If I don't want to just shut them down and then not offer anything because I don't look like I'm contributing to solving this problem. Well, one of the first things that I had suggested, and I've talked about this for a while, is the whole background check system in NCIC, the National Crime Information Center. Now, I know it's a separate argument about background checks because there are some people in the 2A community that think that anything that is extra is an abridgment. And I understand their arguments. I'm pretty straight no chaser when it comes to the Constitution and our rights, and I'm like 2 steps above anarchy on certain things, including the Second Amendment. But I don't believe that you change the law by breaking it. I think you have to show a better way. Now, one of the things that can be done immediately is if you're going to have this background check system, and I understand why it was created. I mean, you had, in the 90s, you had Bill Clinton and you had Democrats that were demanding that there be a mandatory waiting period enacted, and this was trying to stop that by catching bad guys at point of sale. Well, in order to make the system work, you actually have to submit the records to the system. And not every state is doing this. I brought this up at the CNN town hall and was promptly booed because we were there to go after me, and gun owners, we weren't there to actually talk solutions. So, which was sad. Fixing, I know that they had the fix NICs, and there were things that I did not like in fix NICs, et cetera, et cetera. The bottom line is that we shouldn't have to incentivize government agencies to submit all records to NCIC. The NCIC National Crime Information Center, they have a ton of different not a ton, but different classifications of prohibited possessors, people who have all had their due process, they've had their day in court, they've been adjudicated either mentally unfit, or they don't have their rights because they acted in a willfully violent manner. And that, I think, I can't remember what it is state by state, but there are essentially thousands of cases out there that have not been reported to NCIC. And I don't know why the other side of the aisle refuses to have that conversation. And it's really kind of scary when you think about, there's some people out there who probably should not be able to purchase firearms, but because the entity that swears to protect us, that we should probably not own guns because they're gonna do it, they're not doing it. And so you have all of these individuals who are they've sort of fallen through the cracks. That's one thing that could be offered as to them it could look like a compromise, but it's really not. If you make the system work, I don't think that it's in Democrats' best interest to have the system work, because I think they want to start with a waiting period and then eke away our rights bit by bit from there. So I honestly think that there are Democrats who don't want the system to work. They don't care if state agencies are not submitting these records in. They don't care if there are people who can go out and purchase firearms. And that's also a great way to say, why, if you care as much as I do, why are you not willing to meet with me and get this done? No one's calling these people out on the carpet about this. And that could be done tomorrow. It's common ground, and it does not compromise a single right. So that's one thing that could be done. So the other thing has to deal, Chicago's the best example of my other point on this. I had a Marco Rubio moment. So the other thing, I watched Ted Cruz get into a fight with the mayor of Chicago. And Chicago is, I think, one of the most fascinating cities as it relates to 2A, because you had Otis McDonald, who fought to be able to carry a handgun in his neighborhood, and that to really reaffirm Second Amendment rights. He's a hero. And then you have also the AG, and you have the history of prohibition with regards to being able to carry in Chicago, et cetera, and now, of course, the sentencing and the problem of repeat offenders. Now, I know the president has been arguing with the superintendent of Chicago PD, but the superintendent of Chicago PD said something quite interesting about a year ago when he said it's the same 1,400 repeat offenders that are driving over 86% of the city's crime. That was amazing to me. This came out after a story, and I'm taking this from memory because I put all my stuff in Google Docs. There was a professional athlete, his sister was taking her son to kindergarten, and she had a baby in a stroller, and they were walking to school, beautiful, bright, sunshine Chicago morning, 2 individuals that actually should have been either locked away for life or, they should not have been out. They had just gotten probation, and within the first week that they were back out on the streets, they ended up having a disagreement with a gang member, and then they opened fire on what they thought was someone with that gang and ended up striking, killing this mother. And so that was one of the statements that came out when everyone was talking about Chicago's crime. And how these repeat offenders and these 2 brothers have been in and out of the system, violent crimes. It's insane how people who commit violent crimes, whether it's rape and using a firearm in commission of a felony, whatever it is, they're back out on the street sometimes a year or less. That's not a deterrence. Predators and violent offenders should be made to feel terrified. And our legal system doesn't do that. They just look at it as an obstacle. Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, you have some non-violent offenders that get lengthier sentences than violent offenders. And I know that that's kind of a polarizing topic on the right, but we really do have to talk about it to bring some of these people to the table and say, look, why are we coddling violent criminals? So in Chicago, I went on air and I looked at 30 some odd cases of crimes committed by repeat offenders who used a firearm. And every single one of these individuals had a record. I went through it case by case. I spent it was one of the largest segments of my show on this one topic in my entire 10-year broadcasting career, but I went through case by case by case. Every single one of these individuals had been given wrist slaps. And I literally just took 30 random cases. Random. I wasn't even searching for them. And every single one of them reduced and out on probation one by one by one. That's a huge problem. These are the individuals that are driving the crime rates. These are the individuals that good people want to protect themselves from. So why are we not having a conversation? We're talking about criminal justice. Let's talk about some sentencing reform and having some really, really harsh sentencing for these individuals who have chosen that they've made the choice that they don't want to be peaceful, law-abiding members of society. They want to make women and children live in fear. Well, why should they get out in 18 months? That's a problem. It made me think of this story of Bondurant Myers in my hometown of St. Louis. This happened about 6 weeks after Mike Brown. Bondurant Myers, and this was 4 blocks from my old house in St. Louis. Young man, 18 years old, just turned 18 years old. So he was in trouble because several months prior, he had taken police on a high-speed chase down Grand Avenue in St. Louis, which is a very populated street with shops and restaurants and everything else. There's a Qdoba that my kids and I used to eat at all the time. And he wrecked the car, jumped out of the car, was trying to flee from authorities, and he threw a handgun out onto the side of the road. Well, he was under 18 at the time, so that's illegal for him to have been in possession of that. So he's arrested. He's able to, I think his bond was reduced like 1%. He was released. He just had some restrictions as to when he could, I think he had to be back inside at 6 p.m. or something like that. Anyway, long story short, he was in the Tower Grove neighborhood, 4 blocks from my old house, beautiful area, families, and they were fighting basically they were trying to fight to keep drugs out of this area. And there was a plainclothes officer who was walking through Tower Grove, and he was actually watching this notorious drug house in the area, and oh my gosh, out comes Bondurant Myers and a couple of other individuals, one of whom the officer was known to St. Louis police. They see him, one of the guys recognizes him, draws on him, shoots, and this officer fires back, and he kills Bondurant Myers, who would have been alive if he had not been coddled by a weak judge who decided, let's just let him go. That is not helping. Part of helping people, and if we're going to talk about rehabilitation with sentencing, is you've got to be strict. I love my kids. But when they mess up, they don't get off easy just because they're my kids. They get in trouble, and they need to fear consequence. And our system does not do that. And so these individuals feel completely free to go and keep committing the same crimes over and over again. I talked to one officer, I actually St. Louis Police, St. Louis City Police, who was saying, you know, we're out here, it's St. Louis and Chicago, I mean, all the cities it's the same. And he was like, you know, we're out here catching the same people. Every day, it's like the same people, over and over again. And meanwhile, it's the law-abiding folks who are being blamed. And in Chicago, people like Otis McDonald were blamed before he passed away. And you can't have a firearm because these repeat offenders do. That doesn't make any sense. It's a horrible argument. So, sentencing reform, stronger penalties for predators. I know we have Make America Great Again. I also like Make Predators Afraid Again. So here's something else that I want to tell folks when we're talking about best ways, winning ways to message. We are never going to win this debate if we just talk in charts and graphs. Like Paul Ryan, I know Paul Ryan, I don't agree with him on everything, but he's like he is the word nerd, and I say that not in a disparaging way. There's certain people they love the charts and graphs, they love let's just be very clinical about this when we discuss it. We can't with this topic. We cannot. You have to, there's a reason why Jesus preferred parables. You gotta put people in this situation. You have to put the person or people to whom you're speaking in the shoes of someone who needs to defend their family or themselves. I talked about this in my first book because everyone thinks, and I gave a speech recently to a group of college kids, another group of college kids, and I said, I know everyone thinks that I support the Second Amendment and I do what I do because they think I'm just best friends with gun manufacturers. I literally don't know any. I know one. I know George Kelvin from Caltech. That's literally the only guy I know. But when I tell people why I feel the way I feel, because I had to rely on a gun twice now to defend myself, to protect my life. One time was when I was a child. I was probably about 11 years old. I was at my grandparents' house in the Ozarks, and my aunt and at the time was estranged husband he was an abusive, horrible person, and everyone told her not to marry him. Well, one night, it was late summer, it was the weekend before I was getting ready to go back home, because I had a single mom who worked 3 jobs, and so I spent all my summers in the Ozarks with my grandparents, and I heard the wailing of what sounded to me like a wild animal. And they lived in the woods, they lived on the side of an abandoned mine, and the woods were dark and thick, and I had no idea what was coming through the brush, and it terrified me. And it kept getting closer and closer. The window was open. There was an amazing breeze going through, and I was like right at that moment where you're suspended between sleep and wakefulness, and so you hear something and you're not quite sure that what you're hearing is real or if you're just dreaming. And I heard this. It was high-pitched. It sounded like an animal in pain. And it got closer and closer. And then I heard punches in the gravel, something in the gravel, feet, paws, whatever it was. My grandparents had a gravel driveway, and then I remembered, oh my gosh, they actually don't even have a lock on their front door to lock. And about that time, the door burst open, and it was my aunt, who had just been pistol whipped by her estranged husband, who had been detained by police and had been let go. And of course, he immediately goes back drinking and drugging and grabs a gun and beats her up. So she ran in a t-shirt and underwear through the woods to get to my grandparents' house. They lived a half a mile from her in Annapolis, Missouri. And she was bloodied. The orbital socket was broken. She had knocked a tooth loose. She was in bad shape. And my grandparents, it was just my grandparents, that were there. How are they going to defend themselves against him because he's a big man. And my grandpa went and got his gun, went and got his rifle, while my grandmother called the law, as they said. God called the law, Howard, that's what she was yelling. She calls police. This is rural Iron County, Missouri. We only had 1 deputy in that town. And on average, it's about 20 minutes. By the time law enforcement showed up at my grandparents' house, it had been 40 minutes. And my grandma's on the phone with the law. My grandpa gets his gun, and he goes and sits outside on the porch because my aunt was saying that after she ran out of the house, my uncle, her estranged husband, he was pursuing her, and he was screaming at her that he was going to kill her. And he would have, because he's nuts. In fact, he's in prison for life now because he did that to someone else. He killed someone else. And he was put away a long time ago. And so my grandfather went out, sat on the porch with his gun, and I had felt terrified, and it was a fear that I can't describe. You would think, oh my gosh, because I was 11 years old, I'm 11 years old, and I may not see 12. And it's weird, the things that you think, and he did pull down the road to my grandparents' house. He turned his car lights off, and he pulled down the road, and he was going to go and kill her. And it was finally when police responded, 40 minutes later, they caught him as he was leaving the holler, as they said, because he saw my grandpa on the porch with a gun. And that's the only reason why he didn't go and try to kill anybody, because he knew my grandpa would shoot him and kill him. So that made me really appreciate. I know Michael Bloomberg said that, he was talking about tyrannical deer, apparently, earlier, that's what inspired the Second Amendment. I'm not worried about deer breaking into my house and killing me. But it really made me appreciate that a lot more than just the Second Amendment, more for hunting. After Parkland, this was a couple weeks after the town hall, we had individuals that found our address of our previous home here in Texas, and they drove by our house. We lived in a cul-de-sac, and they took pictures and they put them up online. They put my address up online, so we started getting some weird people coming to our house, and death threats and all kinds of stuff. We had a guy, we were going to sell our house. I was too afraid to put our house on the market with all of this happening, so we bought a house, we moved, we were still in the same town, and then I was broadcasting radio because I had a studio in the house. I was broadcasting out of that old house, so we were going back and forth quite a bit as we were moving and relocating. Well, one evening, my husband was at a sporting event with my oldest son, and I was at home with my youngest son, and I got a call from Fort Worth Police. And it was the lieutenant, and he sounded very concerned. He said, I just wanted to call and check on your well-being right now. I'm like, well, I'm okay. Why? What happened? Well, as it turned out, one of the neighbors had called my husband because there was somebody trying to break in my house and banging on the windows with rocks and all kinds of stuff. An individual who did not like me flew from Ohio to my home and tried to break into my house and get at me and my family. And I had no way of knowing that this individual, because when we moved, media people were trying to desperately find out where we lived. They were trying to identify my kids. The Daily Mail, which is one of the largest newspapers in the world, identified my oldest son by the wrong name and tried to find pictures of them. They ended up running a picture of somebody's kid, but it wasn't mine, because I try very actively to keep my kids offline. And so anyway, the police had shown up, and my husband had dropped our oldest son off at home and ran over to the house. They apprehended that individual, and it was terrifying. And my husband, while he was gone, I kept thinking, I have no way of knowing before cops show up there if this guy is going to try to come where we are now. And I'm looking outside. We didn't even have a working alarm system at that house yet. So I was really freaked out, and I went and grabbed my AR-15, and I had mags. All my mags are loaded, and we're ready to rock. So let's do this. And my husband, when this individual was put in the back of the cop car, my husband told the officer, he's like, if my wife had been here, this man will be leaving in a body bag. This would be a different type of call. If I had been here, this would have been a different type of call. They said, we know that. I was like, God bless my Second Amendment right, my AR-15. That was the first thing I went to get. And so when I talk to people about this, I don't know what it is that some of these people who are anti-rights, I don't know why they feel the need to cast aspersions on our characters. The reason that we believe in the right to bear arms, the reason that we're against laws like the ones I'm telling you all about, is because we love life so much that we are willing to give up our free weekends, as my husband and I have done, to train And if, God forbid, we are ever called upon in a situation that presents itself to defend ourselves or defend innocent people, we can do it competently. Because we love life. And even if it is someone that I disagree with, I don't care. I love life, including that person's, even though they might be wrong on everything. I still love their life, and I want them to be okay. That is why we train. That is why we do what we do. I mean, I'm going to tell you something. There is not really many things that would get me to go out in the rain, in the mud, in the middle of the night to somewhere out in Oklahoma where my phone don't even work, to go and do night training with spec ops teams and figure out how to hold a flashlight with my pistol and get yelled at and made to feel nervous and uncomfortable so I can see how I react under stress. I don't do that. I wouldn't do something like that for a lot of things. So I probably really care about this. That's what people don't realize. We do it because we care. And we've seen what can happen when you're not prepared. So I know I want to move into some of the questions, but I want to tell you, don't be afraid to be bold. Do not. Don't be afraid to be bold, and don't be afraid to stand up for people's rights and to push back against this stuff. One of the, as I wrap here, and I do talk radio. I spoke 3 hours before I came here to talk to you all, and I have a problem with not shutting up. This is why Grandpa said he was never taking me hunting again. That man took me hunting one time, and I would not shut up. And he was like, "This is awful." And I don't blame him. I remember being backstage at Parkland and the town hall, and it was not going well. And I felt so bad for the grieving people that were in the audience because I was watching. That's why I was so angry at media, because I watched a cameraman literally zoom in on the face of a crying mother, and it made me angrier than I was like, "Oh God, put a hand over my mouth right now, please, please, please." But I watched, and I don't dislike Marco Rubio, and I'm not saying this because I'm trying to disparage him or anything like that, but I know how hard it is. And he was getting piled on that stage. And I watched as he began making some concessions. And my husband looked at me and he said, "It just got that much harder." I haven't even gone out there yet. And I thought, you can't be afraid to be bold. You are not wrong. You're not wrong. And you have to take comfort in knowing that. So, and when you really hold the line, people will help. People will have your back. If they know that you have theirs and you're taking the arrows, they will get your back.
Amen.
And you will see them come up like a swarm of locusts from Twitter. I don't know what other animal does that besides bees. Maybe insect bees might be better than locusts. But they'll come up like a swarm, and they will protect you. They will have your back. They'll help you in debates because they realize that you're doing this and you're taking these arrows for them. They'll jump in front of you. So don't be afraid to be bold and have faith in your fellow Americans to help you and give you some shade and be your rodeo clown of sorts when you need it, because they will. So be bold. All right, I want to get some questions from you all, and I have so much data, but I don't want to bore everybody half to death by
Two questions, here we go.
Yeah, let's have some questions.
Hi Dana, thanks for being here. When the Parkland shooting happened, I did some research on it, started looking into what the causes and effects were, and I ended up writing an op-ed in a local paper about the ARMS program. I think that's the agreement that Sheriff Israel entered into with the local school district. So when I saw you at the town hall, and I saw the accusations that the sheriff was throwing at you, it was disgusting to me to think that this is a man that purposely turned a blind eye to misdemeanors and felonies that were occurring under his jurisdiction. In my book, we call that an accessory to crime. And if the tools are there to prevent this type of stuff. What I think we actually need is legislation that throws derelict sheriffs like this in bars. And instead, he's now talking about running for re-election. How do we stop this?
Well, and that's an interesting question. So, with regards to the Promise program, which isn't just in Broward, I mean, it's in schools everywhere. Arnie Duncan, as Secretary of Secretary of Education under the previous President Obama, had this idea, and I don't know his heart. And I think we have to put animus aside for a minute because look, I'm a brawler. I mean, and that's something if I'm saying that. I like to think that people were genuine and they wanted to figure out how can we help at-risk youth from charting a life of crime. And I understand that concern. They approached it incorrectly because the way to do that isn't to not report their crimes, it's to figure out first off, why are they doing this? And secondly, how can we help? Because you can't just say we're not gonna report it. We gotta get in there and figure out what's going wrong. And I noticed that with that program, there was nothing in place from Duncan to actually take advantage of people in the community who maybe wanted to help and say, do we need mentors in our community? Do we need families to step up and help this family? Like, what's happening here? We need people to be good stewards of our fellow man. That did not accompany this. And you can't just not report it. Nothing was done to redirect that behavior. And instead what it did is endanger a lot of other people. Now they were calling it something different, but it was still the Promise program. And Scott Israel, the former sheriff, he endorsed it. He released a statement saying that he thought it was great. And a lot of schools began adopting it because if they could show a reduction in criminality, then they could be eligible for a federal grant.
Right.
And Runcie, the superintendent of Broward, got a lot of money because they just stopped reporting it. There's a couple of, I know the Sun-Sentinel actually did some really good reporting on this, particularly from that education angle. And then my very good friend, Andy Pollack, has a book called Why Meadow Died, which is one of the most comprehensive things I think I've ever seen. He wrote that with, I believe, Max Eden, who's an educational analyst. It is one of the most, comprehensive books on not just that program, but also all of the negativity that came with that program and the awful impact that it had in schools. Now, as for him running, I know that Florida lawmakers, they had the MSD commission, and they brought the sheriff before the MSD commission. What they discovered too, by the way, was that Broward County Police were not even kept up with active shooter training. In fact, when they were talking to the Stone and Douglas Commission, which was comprised of sheriffs, security experts, and parents from Broward, MSD parents, what they discovered was that the Broward police had not been kept up to date with active shooter training. In fact, one of the deputies testified that he, quote, could not remember the last time that they had training, end quote. And this is all covered in Andy's book as well, and the Sun-Sentinel covered this. That's why Coral Springs Police, by the way, responded instead of Broward. And that's why the police chief, do you all remember 2 days after this horrible tragedy, the Coral Springs police chief attacked Scott Israel? I thought that was so weird. He had accused him, he intimated that he was just chasing the cameras while other people were doing the work, and I thought, I've never seen this before. Well, now we know why. Coral Springs police had actually been kept up to date, and while Broward, they did not have, my memory's failing me now, they did not have basically an encampment there. They didn't have a base at the school to run direction. Their comms weren't even working properly. It was Coral Springs that responded. And they were the first ones in, actually. So that all came out in the commission testimony. And Ron DeSantis, he was perfectly well within his rights as governor to do what he did in removing, after not just the committee and the Florida legislature made their decision to remove Israel, but then they all voted as a body overwhelmingly. And his sheriff's deputies also had overwhelming vote of no confidence in Israel. But he's going to run again, which I don't know what legislation you would propose to prevent him from doing that. I can't imagine him getting reelected, but at the same time I can, because as I understand from everyone who lives in that area, there were Democrats who were saying he's a great sheriff and he should have his job back. I mean, how can you talk with people who think that? I don't know how I think we're in different worlds.
Well, to me, it's criminal that he can turn a blind eye to felonies and misdemeanors. That's the problem.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I'm not sure, I think that's a good point to bring up to bring up somehow as to how can that be addressed. If you have people like, a sheriff who's not actually following his oath of office, who's not upholding the law, and we're talking about serious felonious behavior, why is nothing being done about this? And I mean, being that I like to pretend to be a lawyer on radio, I'm not exactly sure what the legal answer would be to that, but I think it's absolutely worth exploring, for sure. I think that's a good question.
Last question.
We want you not to shut up like your grandpa. We want you to get only louder, just like Natalie Grant says in her song, You're a Wise Woman with Tremendous Knowledge. I think our youth need to hear, and of course, many liberals want to take our guns. Sometimes we had a bill, House Bill 75 in Alaska, and they were trying to take guns without due process. And sometimes when you're in the minority, don't feel bad about the bills that you don't get passed. Celebrated all the bills you got to kill, and that's one bill that I helped kill. So
Congratulations.
Being on judiciary is critical. Everybody, get on judiciary if you can. Also, I have 3 very brief questions. If you can answer them quickly, I know we're on time. But one, alcohol kills so many people. Why aren't they trying to restrict alcohol? Does that argument work?
Because it's about control.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, if there's any angle, we can use that argument. Second, how do we get rid of judges, that are soft on crime? Because I think they're destroying Alaska, some of them, and probably across the nation. And number third, the Vegas situation, that concert still has me troubled to my soul. Do you have any input? That has gone dead silent, and that terrifies me, that what happened. Thank you.
That's the Vegas massacre. I've never seen a tragedy like that where so little information has been provided afterwards. And I'm a cynic, and I'm always suspicious anyway. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but that doesn't set well with me either. And I've heard so many different theories out there. I'm not sure why. As far as alcohol, you actually bring up a really good point that I wanted to mention, and I only touched upon it briefly because you were using that as an example. I think that we have to, I think that's a great example. If this is about, because ultimately what that question gets to is if it's about saving lives, then why are we not looking at the bigger picture? And I know that you all have heard the statistics, the CDC, or not CDC, the FBI Uniform Crime Reports, the 2018 is out. That's at FBI. Actually, you can go to, just search Uniform Crime Report, UCRs, and it'll take you to an index where you can look, they go back a number of years, and you can actually look, and you can break it down state by state, you can break it down like locality within the country, and you can actually see everything that you would need to know about violent crime, about the perpetrators, all of that stuff. And it gets into, that's where everyone gets the statistic, by the way, that hands, feet, and fists kill more than firearms. It's from the Uniform Crime Reports. But with that, because you're talking about if it's about just saving lives, that really kind of gets to it. It's not about saving lives. It's about control, because you have alcohol and drugs. I mean, right now an opioid epidemic is killing more people than automobile accidents right now, and it is an epidemic. If it is about saving lives, then we would be focusing on the things that would have the most impact in saving lives. We wouldn't be going after, for instance, semi-automatic rifles that are responsible for less than 1% of all lives taken with illegally possessed firearms. So that goes to show it's not about that. To that point, though, you didn't ask this, but this dovetails into it, defensive gun usage. Gary Kleck wrote a response to some of the criticism that he received initially. Reason magazine wrote a piece about how the CDC never bothered making previous surveys from years past public about defensive gun usage. It is real. It does vastly outnumber criminal usage. But there's some nuance there. One of the reasons why there's such a disparity between the 50,000 a year to 2.5 million a year is because different areas classify defensive gun usage differently depending on whether or not a gun is simply brandished or a trigger is squeezed. So it is real. The Clackamas Mall shooting was prevented, this was 4 or 5 years ago, by a man who simply brandished his gun. He did not squeeze a trigger. He didn't even draw down on the perpetrator, a guy who pulled out a firearm, began shooting, and then when he saw that another individual was there, a concealed carry holder, and had brandished his gun, he killed himself. Because he realized that he just met someone who was going to do it for him if he didn't stop. And in certain instances, that would not be considered DGU, defensive gun usage. So there's some nuance here, but it is real. It is absolutely real. And Gary Clegg has the most, and for all the people out there who want to disparage Gary Clegg's validity, he's a lifelong Democrat who loathes Republicans. He is committed to actual logic and intellectual honesty, which I applaud. So I think he serves logic. And you have to go and read the stuff that he has on that.
I hate to be your grandfather in the deer stand.
Well, we ain't hunting, so
Here's what we're gonna do though. They're making us. We gotta be out of this room. So I'm told that you can stick around for a few minutes in the lobby, and so y'all don't stop her in here, guys. If y'all would go to the lobby, you can visit with her. If you go out there, you can still get books. But this room, we gotta be out of in like 60 seconds in order to turn this for dinner.